Hey, fellow G&Ters, those of us like our spirituality with a twist. So we are in the midst of a very G&T kind of project. We like to do these little series, and we're in the midst of a series on cults and cult psychology. We got here by kind of looking at the world around us and going, how can we help make better sense of all this crazy shit going on? We just realized there's a lot of cultapalooza kind of shit happening, and there's a fundamentally sort of like psycho-spiritual educational podcasts. We were thinking, how can we help make sense of this for other people, make sense of us, make sense of it for ourselves? We decided, well, let's do a little series where we talk about the underlying cult psychology that we kind of see operative in the world and in our United States. And so we've done episodes with people who have sort of had their own cult experiences and broken with cults. We just did one recently with Leslie Garrett talking about her finding her way clear of the Jehovah Witnesses, and that was a really deep episode, and I thought profound, her experience. And we've also tried to do things on sort of cult psychology overall. We did a little crash course on the social psychology of conformity and cult psychology, and now we're into the next part of our little project with this, our educational little foray, doing a little crash course on the great sociologist Emil Durkheim for everyone to learn something from and to better understand this idea of social cohesion and ideas like social solidarity. I had to smile because we're bringing back Durkheim for all the Durkheim fans out there. We were joking about that beforehand, but you're gonna learn to love him if you haven't heard of him yet. You'll walk away as a fan. So, anyways, we're doing that, and for those of you who are watching, you'll see a familiar face now. One Ryan K. Davenport, Dr. Davenport. Thanks so much for coming back and talking about this stuff with us.
Happy to be here.
Awesome. Ryan, like, TCM doctor and also like background as an anthropologist, so perfect for this subject matter. So we appreciate him coming on. And that's it. So we'll get into talking about Durkheim. Anything you want to add first, Daniel, about any of this
No, no, no.
stuff?
Let's do it.
Okay, cool. Before we get into it, though, I have to let you all know I'm looking at a little book thing. I'll do a book review when I'm done with it. It's called Cult Like Us, and it's by one Jane Borden, who's an expert on cults for, I want to say, Vanity Fair, but I'm gonna give it a little listen and I'll give a review. And she said that she thinks the greatest cult leader in the world right now is, drumroll, the algorithm. The
Mm,
algorithm is the greatest cult leader.
yeah,
Something Daniel's been talking about since our very first episode, the
yeah.
cult leader called the algorithm. And I'm using that to say, if you want to help our little G&T podcasts escape the clutches of the greatest cult leader and give us a little TLC in the algorithm, please do all the things that people ask you to do, which is liking and subscribing and reviewing and all the normal kind of stuff that people ask you to do, because it helps us out. Hopefully, get this message out to more people because we're trying to help people make sense of their world psychologically and spiritually. All right, so we're going to start talking about this great sociologist, one Emil Durkheim. Uh, I think maybe the like Ryan and I were talking about this, maybe a little backstory in his history. I'll kind of give what I know, and if you have other stuff you want to add, Ryan, we'll just
Sure.
give some context for it. So his years are 1858 to 1917, and he's kind of a founder of sociology. He came from like a Jewish background in France, and his family were like kind of multi-generation rabbis, but he sort of broke with that and went more into like academia and ultimately kind of built up an academic career, was a really important teacher for a lot of great sociologists, finding his way eventually to the University of Paris, where he worked for, the majority of his career as this foundational academic figure. If you do the math on his years, you can see he dies pretty young at the age of 59. And so I got curious, and apparently, he's very, France was involved in World War One, so you can almost like hear the 1917 and go, huh, it's around that time frame. And so he was trying to help with the war efforts, and then he only had one son, and his son Andre went off to fight with the French military and died around that time. So I guess the general understanding was he got burnt out trying to do efforts around the war, and then with the death of his son, he kind of died young of a stroke. So that's what I know of his bio. Do you have anything you want to add on that, Ryan?
Yeah, sure. I mean, he's interesting because he's kind of like one of the fathers of sociology and anthropology. So like both disciplines will kind of claim him. He's really influential on a lot of anthropologists going forward. Um, it's interesting because he's coming from this religious background, right? Of family of rabbis, and he breaks from it, but he does have his own religious experience because Durkheim is interested in this experience of religion, right? And this happens when I believe, during his teenage years, and he has this like intense experience, this like um, perhaps like an ecstatic state, studying with this French nun. Um, but so this, you can kind of see some of the theories that he's 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 trying to make society as science is sort of what his attempt to do. He's trying to make it empirical, something like we studied empirical and less philosophical, but he really does blend the two. And you can kind of see that he's recognized some phenomena that's not necessarily explainable. And he finds interesting ways to kind of describe it and approach it in an understandable way, which I think is going to come out.
Yeah, I got the idea that like he's a philosophical person. He has some religious or spiritual ideas, and then he
Yeah.
also is like a scientific person. So him having an ecstatic experience with like a French nun, that seems like an old school kind of like art movie.
Yeah.
Juliette Binoche can play the nun if you go back old school.
Yeah. And I
Sexy
think at the
French
end of that,
actresses. Daniel Day-Lewis could play a young Durkheim. That sounds like that'd
yeah.
be like old
Yeah.
school.
I don't think
Yeah, then
anybody's
at the
going to
very
make those
Kind
end
of
of it,
references.
sexy
they
art
just
movie. I
dance,
like
right?
the idea of it.
Yeah, they dance at the end. That's the most important thing, and you don't know why.
I don't think
Yes.
anybody's getting those references, Eric.
Oh, people do, Daniel. Some people watch movies that you don't.
Right. I'm just saying our audience is probably is not.
I bet you people do know Juliette Binoche, and I bet you they do know Daniel Day-Lewis. But we'll see. You can comment in the comments if you've heard of Daniel Day-Lewis. He's a big fucking actor, Daniel. Guy's won like a gazillion fucking Academy Awards.
Right. And I know
He
the
just won,
audience that
he was
we
just
have.
in like the Academy Award like a month ago. If you don't know who Juliette Binoche is, she's super hot. She's French. So if you don't know her, you'll be thankful that I set you up with this. Watch Unbearable Lightness of Being, folks. You get a lot of Juliette Binoche and Lena Olin, and it'll be hot. Yeah. So, okay, so there's lots of things to say with Durkheim. You can kind of do like social facts, right? I thought that would be like a place to start, right? So, and I think it kind of fits into our wheelhouse because we like to talk about that kind of stuff a lot. So I'll kind of throw out what I sort of have about it and then, get your all's reaction too. I think it's really interesting. So he talks about this idea that social facts things are true in the society. And he makes a big point, what I understand it, that they kind of limit the possibilities of the individual and they become the facts of that society in which the individual works, which is like kind of right in our wheelhouse, right? He also has this idea that the social facts are kind of almost like the laws of physics or something like that. They're kind of unavoidable things. If you function in society, you're going to hit the social facts. And as part of his idea, like what you were talking about, Ryan, as I get it, societies are kind of their own things that have to be studied, based on their own facts, right? So that's part of the idea of these social facts. And one of the other sides of this is that, society is just stronger and will tend to impose its sort of will and expectations on the members of that society. And so he kind of also talks about this idea that it's anything or any manner of action that exercises control over an individual and kind of gives them like external restraints that are going to control them and kind of guide them into where they're going to go, right? So any manner of action capable of exercising over the individual external constraint. So we have like some things to say about that kind of stuff. And you and I have talked about this too, this idea that these things tend to be a little bit pervasive, like through a society. Like once you look, you'll find those social facts kind of cropping up all over the place. So I'll be interested what you think about that, Ryan, and like you too, Daniel. And then like when you get down to like sort of, maybe like what you're talking about really explicitly, these will be things like laws and morals and beliefs and customs and fashions, things that are just like commonplace and like assumptions within that social system. So those are the social facts. I'll throw it out to you all. You got stuff on this, Ryan or Daniel?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, basically, one of the things that he's trying to do, and you hit upon this, Eric, is he's trying to look at social institutions, social artifacts, right? These are, whether it's religion or economics, your roles in society, societal norms, like looking at how they shape the person and kind of create, the cause this like coercive control over the person. He's very much interested in that and interested in how you can by studying these institutions, you can study the rest of society, right? In fact, one of the criticisms of Durkheim is that he does not leave sufficient agency for the individual. That's not to say that these aren't good ideas, but that's probably he may focus a little bit too much on society in some ways. But when we look at society, and I think what will become apparent throughout this episode is the level of control, right? That society has on the individual, the force that society has on in shaping the individual and maintaining the individual in society.
Yeah, it kind of fits into almost some of the Taoist stuff you were talking about last time we got together and we're chatting. So it does fit into that whole idea, right?
Right, right. And something I think you guys have talked about in the past, where it's like, in order to when you go down that spiritual path, right? When you are trying to find authentic self, there's a lot to scrape away, right? There's a lot of that social influence, and then when you do it, right, you can pay the price. And Durkheim talks about this, right? He's like, there's a lot of social pressure, and you try to break away from that to be the authentic self, you're going to feel it, and there may actually be serious repercussions when you do it,
Yeah.
um, life-threatening repercussions.
Yeah. And you get something you want to add on it, Daniel?
No.
All right. So for me, I was sort of thinking about like, my own experience with this. We try to get a little personal at times. And so the part that really jumped out to me, in my life, and, all of us have known each other for a bit, right? So it's things that we have talked about, like sort of off mic with these
Get a
things.
little
And
bit,
some
a
of the stuff,
little bit closer, Eric.
some of us
Just
we
look.
talked about sort of like in mic too, right? So for me, like, I think where I really hit this idea, and I think even learning about this terminology from him and really like internalizing it sort of helps me think about it a little bit, was I hit like social facts in the way I think about like love and relationships. That was the big thing that I like popped right into in terms of social facts stuff. We won't get to do the whole thing. We've done episodes on this before, but we've talked about like the relationship psychologist Esther Perel and her distinction between like what she calls exclusiveness and uniqueness approaches to love and life and relationships and all those good things. And the exclusiveness person is more based on the idea, like kind of what you might call like kind of monogamy kind of things, where, the idea of like the fact that it's just you and that other person creates the core of the relationship and gives it its value. So that's the way she talks about it. And maybe on continuum, there's other folks that are more like on what she calls the uniqueness end. And these are people who are looking for like more like unique connections. And they're a little bit more open to like everything doesn't have to be met by this one person and everything doesn't have to be so exclusive just to this one person, right? There's more of a idea that you can be more connected with people in more ways. We've done episodes in the past and we don't have to go through it all. I'm sure we'll talk about more of this stuff in the future, but it was a big deal in my life because I kind of decided as a person who was kind of conscious of like, okay, I don't mind rejecting the social facts. I purposely wanted to reject the social facts at times. And I saw it as being kind of part of my maybe Zen calling or Taoist calling or tantric calling, right? That in those traditions you can do that. So I was pretty open to the idea, like, okay, I recognize I didn't know that term, social facts, or that phrase, but I was like aware, like, okay, I'm gonna like maybe buck some of the things that maybe seem like the social norms or something. And I sort of went out a little bit naively as I thought, okay, I feel good with myself about this. I'm happy with my doing this. And I went out not even with the idea that it always had to be a sexual relationship, though that's cool, but also the idea like just deep emotional and intellectual connections. And I just went out like with this open heart, an open mind, an open philosophy. And then what I've realized over the course of my life is I just rammed into the social facts. And the social facts of the culture are like exclusivism, right? That's the social fact of the culture. And I like popped right into it in this really dramatic way. And it's funny to me because I was like doing this little Durkheim research. Daniel, you and I have talked, and Ryan and I have talked at different times. My brother and other people who love and care about me have just been like, the social facts are working against you. You're running headlong in the social facts, my man. And I was like, yeah, you know, but that's been sort of my, I would say, major experience of this. And maybe even a little phrase like this is kind of helpful. You sort of begin to realize, okay, I'm bumping into social facts. Not that I didn't know that, but even like kind of getting the idea that, you know, there's these really hardcore facts of this type. And they're, in a certain sense, within that society, they're almost like the laws of physics. They're almost like gravity or electromagnetism or something. And I happen to crash into these things. So, anyways, that's my experience of like crashing into the social facts.
Eric,
How it's been for you all, but anyways, and both of you have told me, like Daniel and I have talked, and he's been like, and Ryan and I have talked, and he's been like, So
Eric, Durkheim talks about this like pressure that you can feel, like when you run into these social norms, and and you're going against them, and he talks about this palpable pressure that you can feel. Would you say you felt that yourself?
yeah, I mean, like I would, I look at each of us are learning, right?
Yeah.
All three of us and people who are listening are learning. So when I look at my own like learning experience, it was a lot of like you find your own voice and you feel good about that. So I felt maybe a little bit, if I reflect on it, kind of the euphoria of finding your own truth. Daniel and I were texting about that today a little bit, this idea you can find your own truth and share it. So that felt really good. And then you'd go out and maybe I had a naivete.
Well,
It wasn't,
your own truth, but not your own truth in a postmodern sense that like you're seeing things that are not there and but they're true for you. I think you mean your own truth in the way of like your own authentic way of being, something that is verifiable for you. Not, like you're stating like facts or laws, if you will, not in a scientific sense, but like facts of society that are existent within, not in a tangible way that you can touch, but that are carried and shared between people. And then when you hold a view that is counter to these societal implications or implementations, if you will, that people are going to present them to you. And not only are they going to present them to you in words, they're going to present them to you in feelings. And like you were saying, you bump up into them. However, if you're in a authentic way of being, that's the truth of who you are. So
yeah,
you're living that kind of a thing.
it's hard to say, like what's true for other people, right?
Of course.
Yeah. But I mean, for myself, what was really interesting about this was it wasn't like, we all have our experiences and who we meet and the connections we feel with people. And it wasn't like I didn't find people that I felt deeply bonded with, and I think that was reciprocal. It wasn't
Mm,
like, something unrequited or something. I had like really the experience of like, wow, these are real soulmate type people.
mm,
And I really love them and I really care about them. But what would happen in the end is inevitably it would be like, well, you really can't be a part of my life unless we're exclusivist. And eventually I'll probably have to just cut ties with you because otherwise it'll upset some other partner in my life. And it'll, and that's just how it played itself out. And so I don't know. It's been kind of interesting. I haven't had a problem of like, my mom knows I feel this way. Family members, you all as friends know I feel this way. So I didn't feel it from the people who were close to me, where I really felt it was this moments of sort of like moments of truth, where you're like, okay, I really love you. I really feel close to you. We can figure out some way of being in each other's lives and getting the message like, no, we really can't because, this is like, I can't do that. I have to be this exclusive, this person. Right. Because
But
that's the,
those
that's the
people were
expectation put on me. So that's where I think I really felt it. Mhm.
So it seems like those people were really feeling it, right? This is those examples of those people who were
Probably true.
involved with were very much feeling the social pressure, to conform, right?
I think that's
Which
probably true. I mean, I got like, having had conversations and these rare instances where it's people really close to my soul, it was, yeah, I think that was something that they felt. Yeah.
right.
and Durkheim describes this as like unrelenting pressure. Like it's really hard to break out of this. Which is why when we talk about sort of this authenticity thing, it's a move. Like it is a strong move you have to do, and it's not supposed to be easy.
Yeah. And I think, like we were talking about last episode, there's some fear involved in this, right? And we talked a little
Yeah,
bit about, the Chinese medicine, a little bit of fear,
sure.
right? And like having to have some will to do this. And again, it's an ongoing theme for us, but from my perspective, I don't know if there's a way to, I think you can spiritually progress forward in different ways, but I think this ends up being like a core question
Mhm.
every person at some point or another is going to have to face in whatever issue it is for you. I tried to share like my example of this, right? Because I was thinking, where did I really hit the social facts? And this has
Yeah.
been like the fact of my life that this was a social fact that I hit. Do you all have examples? I know, you know, if you don't, it's cool, but do you all have examples where you felt like you hit something and you're like, wow, I really, I hit something that you feel like you can share? Maybe, you know,
No,
maybe.
not at all, Eric. You're completely by yourself. You don't relate to anything you're saying. It's like we Daniel and I just follow, along with what society says.
Well, I mean, like, it depends on what
I
you
get
feel
it.
like you want to share.
Sure, sure. No, I mean, I think sometimes it's as simple as, like for me, it's just sort of like, you and I have talked about this. It's sort of like, having kids. I'm like, this seems like it would suck, and there's social pressure with, yeah, you should have kids. And to me, it was like, no. And like, it's just, this seems like it's, it kind of takes away from sort of who I want to be. I think all of us going into Chinese medicine in East Asian medicine, right? That's a move, right? That goes counter to society,
I was
which
really aware of that, like going into it, I was pretty
yeah,
cognizant of that. And I was
yeah,
also, someone teaching, I've been aware of that with students too.
yeah,
You are making a move when you do this. It's bold. I respect
right,
it. Did you
yeah.
feel like the social pressure along the kid thing? Did you like, was it what Durkheim was talking about? You felt that pressure from people?
Yeah, I would say that's the time where it's sort of like, you can feel it when you're around other people, because the vast majority of people, especially where I live, like technically where Daniel lives too, like, it's like a lot of families that have kids and it's sort of like, you and I have talked about this too. We're like, I do not fit here. Like, this is not, the society that's surrounding me is not representative of who I am, right? And you feel that. And you can also tell the way people look at you too, because they're making judgments, right? And so people always want to see other people doing the things they do because it strengthens their own identity, right? And their sense of self. And when you do things that go counter to the choices other people have made, that becomes a threat to them, right? And that's where you get that social pressure and sometimes danger.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. And did you have something, do you have any example you want to share? Others, I'll talk about this thing with crime because it does fit
Yeah,
into.
let's move on.
Yeah, yeah. So the whole thing with his way he thinks about criminality is interesting with this too, because he has something a little counterintuitive. Normally you would think he kind of frames it like almost like crime isn't entirely a bad thing. And what he's really getting to, as I understand it, or what's applicable for us, is that like punishment has to sort of be there. The minute you have social facts, you have to have punishment. And if you like, and what it does in a way is it reminds people what the social facts are, right? So this,
Mm.
like it's not just a question of like deterrence and it's not just a question of punishment. It's like sort of gives like the group a chance to go, these are the social facts. We're going to teach that to you now and remind you what they are. And I thought that's really interesting in him too. That kind of counterintuitive way he talks about like crime and punishment, right? That it kind of gives this the group to say, okay, here's where our constraints are, and we're going to reinforce that. And he also makes a big point that it has to have a little publicness to it, right?
Yep.
It's not like enough just to privately punish the person. There's a public aspect because that like tells everyone here's a reminder of what the rules are.
Yeah. Here are social and moral boundaries, and we're going to remind you of them, right? And so you can see this, when people are younger, and they're testing their, I used to say throwing bricks at their moral boundaries and finding out where they actually are, and seeing the backlash of society. That reminds people. Sometimes it's a crime. Sometimes it's a shaming of sorts. Which certainly you can see historically through literature, but also just present throughout society. Um, yeah, I mean, it's interesting in itself because you look like Durkheim when he was growing up, he's described as when he goes to university, um, and he's described as a belligerent student, and he's
Oh
like
yeah.
he's like really smart. He's a belligerent student, like is kind of disrespectful to like his professors and so forth, and he's like not very well liked, you know. And so it's interesting that he would kind of come up with this, right?
Yeah, Einstein was kind of like that too, right? And
Yeah,
Daniel and I both love Einstein, and he had that like contrarian streak in him, right?
yeah,
Yeah. But I think like the public aspect is interesting of it to me because it's like it gets to his point, right? We're gonna remind not only this person who committed the thing, but everybody,
yeah,
look at this, right? So it kind of makes an example. And if you've ever been in any situation where someone has like tried to publicly shame you for something, you're like, oh, you know, for my
yeah,
little anecdote in my own life, it's probably not coinky dink that like one of the first big American novels is like The Scarlet Letter,
Right.
Which is
That's
all
exactly
about
what I was
like
thinking.
breaking like relational and sexual taboo and all that. And like, you get to wear this label of punishment, right?
Right.
And I had I mean, from that social pressure point, I did have a consciousness of that. I'm really grateful to Daniel in this podcast, my man Daniel, who I love, right? Because, we were open to like talking really honestly about a lot of really difficult subject matters. I'm also grateful to people I talked about outside of the podcast, but people I was close with who I said, hey, can I talk more publicly about how I feel about these things without, you know, getting Hester Prynne, the character from the Scarlet Letter, you
Yeah.
end up being the person who people think look askance at. And I got more positive feedback from people like, no, it's okay if you talk about what you think about this. And it's been cool. And again, I really appreciate Daniel's support in this and your support, Ryan, and other people, because it changed it for me. I did feel a lot of a doubt and maybe some fear about that. Right. And then it was like, okay, let me go through and and I always thought that would have to be private, on some level. And then
Yeah.
in doing this thing, I went, okay, I'll make this part public. And it kind of diffused a lot of stuff for me because I didn't feel that tension between what I actually thought about this part of life and, what I had to present as a public face.
I do have one, Eric, that this is kind of interesting. It's not as dramatic, but it's just when my present spouse and I were dating, it was because she's South Asian, and like we would go into restaurants and like we would go into like let's say like a cafe, typical like suburban or like cafe where the majority of the people are like whitish, right? And she would just get these nasty looks, um, from like a lot of like older white women, right? And it was like she's like, this is uncomfortable, and then when I would go into restaurants, like Indian restaurants or wherever, I would get these nasty looks. I mean, people would just be dead staring at me, just kind of dog staring at you, like, okay, we are clearly not welcome here, right? So kind of another example of sort of like when you do something that's like, now it's like not that big of a deal, but there's some parts of the country where it is a big deal, right? But you still sort of feel like this underlying judgment and sort of social pressure. But obviously for us, we're like, yeah, kiss my ass, right? So it's like it kind of took, we actually kind of enjoyed it, to be honest, at a certain level. But you sense that, around you.
Yeah. I think about it a little bit like, I had my time with my psych mentor
Yeah.
and I kind of bring this up sometimes in classes that I teach, this moment
Mm.
when you're talking with a psychologist, you're talking with a clinician and you're getting to like a tender point, right?
Yeah.
And I got to this point where I was talking to, my wonderful psych mentor, one Dr. Michael Schnur, and I did feel that thing you're talking about, Ryan, because it was the first time I was going to tell somebody or tell him. I maybe told some other people a little bit, but tell him like, hey, I think differently about love and relationship. I just don't agree with this culture. At least it doesn't fit me, you
Yeah.
know? And I felt like this incredible tension inside of me because I felt like if I reveal this, we talked about some different episodes in the past, but I felt like
Yeah.
if I revealed this, is he going to judge me or say I'm a bad person? I could feel that tension, right?
Sure.
And in that in a certain sense that it would be like you hit the social fact and he might judge me too. So,
Yeah.
and he didn't.
Well, and some therapists will.
Yeah,
Sure.
Some
yeah,
therapists will. For me, those therapists they shouldn't even be able to practice. That should be a bound, I guess I could say, opportunity to lose their license.
Agreed.
Like you don't, if you're bringing in the rules of society into a place of vulnerability and sharing as people are working through their issues, you have no business working with human beings. You could just go publish your dumbass fucking opinion on your stupid Facebook page or wherever, and the 10 people that agree with you will give you a thumbs up, and then you could feel good for 10 seconds and then go about the rest of your day. It's just there's no place for that. And I've heard it many times from patients, friends, and family members that when they have gone into a therapy session and the therapist is like, "Oh, well, why don't you just accept this?" You just have to accept that. You're gonna have to this is the way that it is, and you're gonna have to accept it. Of course, accepting of things is part of the breaking free of it because you have to recognize it and then integrate it and not fight everything. That's fair. But that doesn't mean that I have to change the way that I am, in order to accept this external fact that I inherently think is wrong, was not set up by me, and is being maintained by people who I don't even really care about. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's just, yeah, it has no business. And unfortunately, if you get it from friends, okay, or whatever, that's fine. They're that's that. But when you're in a place of vulnerability that you're paying for, or at least your insurance is paying for, it has no place, in my opinion.
Yeah, Daniel, when you said that, it just made me think of sort of all of us who treat patients on a regular basis, and what would happen if we suddenly would like judge them or like like not give them that space to kind of freely process and open up, like
Hmm.
it's that's going to completely, stymie their healing process, right? You just
Yeah.
don't do it.
That would make us dry needlers. Oh, sorry if that bothered anybody. No, it's not going to bother anybody because nobody knows what that is. No one gives a fuck.
This is true.
That's like the physical therapist who steal our acupuncture shit, essentially.
Yeah.
Yep.
I agree
Overeducated
with you.
personal trainers.
Are they doing that too?
No, 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 no. But
Oh,
well, let's be honest. Some probably do.
it's
Anyway.
like I think you're exactly right, and like I've heard those stories too. There was a friend who was talking about one of her friends who was going to a therapist, and the therapist made him write out every single little thing he might have done wrong in the most like dramatic detail in any of his sexual lives and experiences. And I was like, yikes. I was
Hmm.
like, ah,
Are you sure that wasn't like a priest? I mean,
Yeah. Or a fetish,
it
like
was,
yeah, I was gonna say tell me all the things you did that were naughty. Don't
right.
leave out any details.
I'm gonna record this for later.
you're a
Yeah.
bad boy. I
You
want to
have
hear all
been.
the bad things.
You've been a real naughty one.
Yeah.
Well, anyways, I heard it and I was like, you're shitting me. Really? And it was in this very judgmental tone, and I was like, oh my God, happens, right?
The pressure of conformity isn't held by anyone but by everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, it gets to the social psychology connects into what Durkheim is trying to say here too, right? But it kind of pulls the thing together. I guess I do find it helpful to say, yeah, there's social fact and then there's like this punishment aspect, right?
Hmm.
And it's just kind of clear to like get conceptual about, okay, this is what these things are. So,
And on one aspect of it, it is necessary to establish laws so that the people who would commit crimes, if you will, there is some deterrent for that to occur. So that, that is the positives is that like some boundaries are hard and you can't get out, but some boundaries are necessary so that other things don't come in. This is the light and the dark side of that.
yeah, that interesting of like if you're talking about a law to control actual criminality, and then in his list things like morals and beliefs and customs and fashions you're going to impose on people, then you're maybe into something different. But I do agree you need something with that.
Yeah, of
Obviously,
course.
there's
Yeah.
those borderlines, and I think you're right. You can kind of make a distinction between those things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
All
they're
right, y'all.
dynamic too, right? So they change over time, right? And so we've talked a little bit about this before. I'm not sure on this podcast, but these contestations of culture where like there's always people pushing on the periphery to expand and change those social norms, right? That's needed for, society to grow, right? But there's a battle on that periphery.
But I had that thought. I thought, well, for my kids and for I don't know, maybe just as a statement in the world, I'll try to live my life differently.
Yeah.
And it'll be kind of like make it like it to the extent that you feel like you make a statement with your life, right?
Yeah.
Every little thing maybe pushes the karmic wheel a little bit,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You
I
feel
guess they
like,
call it
okay,
creating
I'll make a
space for other
statement with
people,
this.
something like that, right?
I'm sorry, what'd you say?
Like creating space for other people. I think
Yeah,
that's a
yeah.
term that,
Or just, I mean, maybe energetically pushing the universe a little bit if we want to get a
yeah,
little like mystical twistical about stuff.
sure.
Push a space and see if you can move things a little bit
Hmm.
more towards, I suppose, like the idea of something that's more like freedom, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely sort of what you guys are trying to do here. And and probably what we try to do in our lives in general is sort of like, bring a little authenticity to the world. And maybe that affects other people, in a positive way, right?
Yeah. All right, so I guess I'll move and I'll do like types of societies because this is another big deal that he talks about, right?
Yeah.
And getting to our culty stuff, obviously what you can get is if you have social facts within a cult thing and you can get punished, you can see where that gets potentially culty. You know, I've been really interested in the idea of exploring in our episodes together this notion of like, okay, we have cult in the more narrow sense, and Ryan likes to make this point whenever we talk. So like David Koresh or something down in Waco, Texas, that's like a cult in the strict sense, right? And then we have things that are more on those borderlines, even like Jehovah's Witness. Is that a religion? Is that a cult? Obviously, for someone that we had like a guest like Leslie Garrett, she's like, no, this is a cult, right? A lot of people would agree with that, and she broke out of that thing. And then this notion of like, well, there's like a cult psychology maybe that we're all vulnerable to. For the Cult Like Us book I was talking about earlier, she's like, yeah, she uses the phrase. It's in the little preview of the book. You can get those little 5 minutes. She's like, oh yeah, America's one big cult. And I'm like, yeah, I'm cool with that. So I'm
Yeah,
interested in
it's
that piece too, or the idea that we've all talked about this notion. I think
sure.
Daniel, you like tendency or vulnerability, this idea that there's something in human beings that can kind of go that way, right?
Well, there's a concern. Every so if you consider the human mind as like maybe a compartment, a large compartment of smaller compartments, there is a few of the compartments within this bigger thing that are carrying beliefs that are externally implemented or imprinted on the human from a very young age. Some of these are laws, or we want to call them morals, ethics, whatever, but we'll just call them, societal facts for the purpose of this conversation. Those are there and reinforced early on, some of which are good, and some of which are go from society to society. The Ten Commandments, right? The golden rule. These are some things that get passed. But then there's other smaller things that are more local, more tribal, if you will, and then change as time goes on. We still have no real societal rules for like internet ethics. That's not a thing. You know what I'm saying? So like, there's this. And if you're not aware that those things are not a fixture of your mind, then they're going to just exist. And as soon as somebody pushes up against one of the boundaries of those things that were filled that you weren't even aware of or you don't remember filling yourself, you're going to find out. As they say, you're going to fuck around and find out because someone's going to say something or do something that's going to trigger you. And if you don't like that word, it's going to bother you or it's going to set off an alarm of something inside that is like, hey, dunk, 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 dunk. That's not right. That's not right. That's not right. That's not right. And on one hand, maybe, of course, it's good, hitting a woman. Okay, that's not right. We're going to, say, hey, that ain't right. Or on another hand, in the case of, Ryan, they're going to say, hey, that's a light-skinned man with a dark-skinned woman. That's not right. But it doesn't matter who it's from. It could be from Caucasians in the suburb, or it could be from Indians on Devon in Chicago, where they're like, who's that, white devil, that uncle, the white ghost with our beautiful brown skinned lady? Get out of here. You know what I mean? And then from Eric, it's like, oh, well, you're pushing the boundaries of what we feel comfortable with in terms of monogamy. So, like, there's something wrong with you, obviously. So you're there, so you're a flawed thing. But I don't think that people walk around thinking about that. I think people are far more self-absorbed, except these programs are lying underneath. And as soon as you pop up on them, then they're like, boom, then they become the kind of first and foremost thing in their mind, and they react based upon all of that. And it's incumbent upon at least what we've been saying, not just in this episode, but in many, many episodes for the last, damn near coming up on 5 years. You know, you have to root those programs out. You have to go in and decide for yourself, is that who I want to be? Did I say yes to that? If I didn't say yes to that, then why do I walk around with it? And why is it dictating my actions, behaviors, and feelings in this moment? It is to me the definition of being unconscious, you know?
Yeah, we were talking about the Tao Te Ching today between the three of us. We were sending some texts around. Ryan had a really cool translation of like the first chapter of it. And, like I was skimming the book again, as I sometimes do, right? You pull it off the shelf, there's all kinds of delightful things in there, obviously, that you can learn. But, that's a major project in a lot of the spirituality things to make the unconscious conscious, right?
Mm-hmm.
And say, okay, this is the stuff. And it's like it is kind of like a scraping project, right? It's so funny.
Mhm.
We've been using that word because I literally just sent a text to someone yesterday Like I had to go through this process of like scraping shit out, right?
Yeah.
And I was using that almost exact language, right? And then
Yeah, I know I have this background in archaeology, and so it's like you explicate the layers, right? You take layer by layer off, and then eventually you find like a cool artifact, right? I mean, it's just like a interesting little metaphor there, right?
it's like finding your authentic self under a bunch of junk, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
It's a Buddha nature metaphor, right? And a
Yeah.
lot of the Buddhist stuff, right? All right, well, I guess I'll do types of societies because it does fit into this conversation, right? Like, why are people so reactive? Like, what's happening? So Durkheim does this deal, and I'll just kind of lay it out maybe one at a time or something, and we can kind of discuss it. So he says there's really kind of two types of social organization. You can think of maybe like a whole society or maybe like individual groups within there, right? And one he calls mechanical, and it's a weird word. And I think he's thinking about like cogs in the machine or something, where the members of that group are just much more similar to one another. And he calls this like kind of a mechanistic group or a mechanistic society. So similar members, right? And because they're similar members, they all share like the same strong sets of ideas, right?
Right.
So they'll hold like the same strong kind of like norms and codes and moralities, right, that are there without so much of these little individual differences, right? So that leads to if someone like kind of what Daniel was bringing up, if someone deviates in some way, it's more obvious to punish then because there's much more like homogeneity within that group. So when someone starts to stand out, like the old thing about the nail that stands out gets pounded down kind of a thing, it's
Sure.
easier for that person to kind of stick out. The other things about it is like there's probably like you don't have the same individual freedom because there's lots of pressure, like you were talking about, Ryan, to be another one of the people within that more mechanistic kind of structuring group, right? And maybe the last piece of it would be something like, in terms of like our main theme about like cultiness, this creates a strong cohesion within that group because everyone
Sure.
feels their similarity. And if someone deviates, they get punished and get knocked back in the line. And it creates this really strong sense of like social cohesion. So for our theme of like cultiness, right? Social cohesion, social solidarity, you get into those little culty groups, and this is going to be very intense, right?
Yeah, like
But
Mormon, like a Mormon group, right?
yeah,
There's other ones, Mennonites, very dress very similar. Amish dress very similar. You know, I mean, but we can go non-religion. We could say gangs dress very similar. Teams, sports teams dress very similar. I mean, you go even larger cultures have similar dress to identify themselves from other cultures or other tribes. Even within cultures, there's tribes based on region or whatever that dress very similar. Same language, ethics, religious practice, food. Hell, I don't even know sexual practices. Who knows? You know what I mean? I don't know, it's a thing.
I'm watching the old school like Luke Cage series, the old Netflix
Yeah,
Marvel
sure.
thing, and like you can really see like it's a little bit of an exploration of like sort of that culture of these mobsters, right? It's a mob story essentially, right?
Yeah,
And there's like codes, and you break the code, everyone knows, right?
yeah,
Snitches get stitches and all that kind of stuff. So it's a real thing. And you can
yeah.
see the characters are sometimes like, you know, the rules of this. I know the rules of this, and they all understand one another from that point of view, right?
Yeah. But Durkheim's gonna like make this argument, right? He's because he's coming during this time in anthropology and social science where they're like looking for these grand theories, these evolutionary theories. And so he sees like the mechanical societies more like what's referred to as like traditional societies or smaller societies. At the time they would have said maybe simpler. Durkheim didn't really like that explanation because he thought there was a fair amount of complexity in him. Um, and then these organic societies, which were more like larger state level societies, right? And so, but and he gets kind of maligned for this, and there's problems with both of these ideas because evolution and social, there's not a universal way that societies develop. And just to kind of point that out. Having said that, some of these ideas, with the social pressure in smaller groups and larger groups, I think are true, right? The way you're kind of phrasing it, Eric, makes sense. But I just want to sort of point out sort of like kind of what the initiative was during that time. Then he's using this term mechanical, which like that's right during the Industrial Revolution. So like it makes sense that that would be forefront of the mind.
It's such a weird term, but he's getting to like people being much more similar, like,
Yeah,
pistons in an engine or, like similar
yeah,
cogs in the machine. I mean, part of what we're doing is we're trying to understand the world around us, and it's
yeah,
not even really being a hater or anything, but like a lot of Trumpism is rural,
yeah.
right? And like that's going to be much more mechanistic, right? You know, where you get much
I
more
don't.
people. Oh no, that's just a factoid. Like Trumpism is like the rural parts of the United States vote Trump. There might
I
be other
mean,
places too, but like that's just a statistical factoid.
right. And yes, and also the statistical factoid is that, like it or not like it, like the majority of the people, not by a massive amount, but the majority of people voted for him. So it is not, to me, it's not simply rural versus non-rural. Rural tends to vote Republican anyways. So I don't know that that's Trumpism or not Trumpism. I, I'm sure they're not losing it. The Team Red is not losing votes. You know what I'm saying? Regardless of their candidate, it could
No,
be
but I've listened to some of these people who are in these like conservative environments, right? And there's like a lot of pressure on them because there's a lot of similarity within the group, right? Now
of
that might
course.
happen in any group, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you get to like I mean, we can, all have our own feelings about this, but I think if you do get to like areas where you can get people who are much like, I know people from like East Texas and shit, right? There's just this mechanistic quality to that in the sense that there's this expectation of a lot more similarity
Sure.
people,
I think this
and there's
works
gonna be
well.
pressure around that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think this works well when you look at cults. I think there probably is a little more variation in the rural areas, and that's kind of again sort of when you're using relatively simplistic, theories, like you run into problems of variation, right?
We're talking about
With
like
some rural
relatively
areas.
relatively speaking though, you know what I mean, Ryan?
Well, yeah, but there's some rural areas that could be fairly liberal, right? In some larger cities that may be more conservative. I mean, but I think in general, we can say, rural America tends to be more Trump-like. I think a better way of utilizing this theory, or another way of using it, would be to look at the evangelicals, right? These are small, close-knit groups, right? Which have a tendency, not 100%, to view Trump as almost like a messianic figure, right? Um, and then they are very closed, right? Anybody can look at that model, and then if someone goes outside of those norms within that small community, yeah, the pressure is going to be pretty strong, right? The pressure to conform is going to be pretty strong, if that makes sense. Right?
I mean, I don't like I agree with you. You're not gonna get something like Apple's absolute mechanistic,
Sure.
but you can get things that look a little bit more like within that framework, right?
Hmm.
I guess I mean there's different ways of using these kinds of ideas. Obviously, like I
Right.
suppose for me as like a conceptual tool, I think okay, the more commonality you get between the members of the group,
Yeah.
right, the more you're gonna get this kind of pressure building up, right? So the closer, if you look at it maybe on a continuum or something, the
Yeah.
closer you get to that, the more pressure that's going to build. Whether we can like debate whether a rural example is the best example, but it did cross my mind, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
you can get a lot more commonality within those groups. Everyone might be same race, same religion, same whatever, right? You're going to, less diversity or something will create more of this kind of pressure.
That's the key right there. Less diversity, and that doesn't necessarily mean racial diversity. Less
Yeah.
diversity of thought creates more pressure on the individual to conform. That's, in my mind, that's that's
Yeah, I
what it
agree. I
is.
think that's the heart of it.
Yeah,
We can kind of figure out where that is,
Well,
correct.
if
on a
you have
continuum, the
people,
more you get to that, probably you're going to feel more of that stuff,
Yeah.
right?
like the more isolated a person is, right, the less opportunities they have to interact with other people and people who may not share their worldview, right? The easier they can be controlled by the group that they're in.
Correct.
I think that makes sense.
And what's this last bit here, Eric?
Well, the other part is the organic idea. So he says maybe two types of groups, right? And they're archetypal. So the critique that you're bringing up
Mhm.
is fair, Ryan. I mean, no one's going to fit this like perfectly, right?
Yeah.
But maybe they're on something like a continuum for the purpose of the conversation or something,
Sure.
right? So he uses this word organic with this, and he's trying to get to the idea of like where there's more diversity amongst the members and they fit together more sort of like the different organs that make up the body or something, right?
Yeah.
It's just like
Again,
cogs in the machine
interdependence,
or
I think, is the term he
differentiation.
uses, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And so in that sense, like a lot more diversity amongst the people who might make up that group, right? Um, greater individual differences are going to be okay because everyone's kind of having their own different vibe within that group, even though it might hold together and fit. The bonds, though, in that case, will be sort of like less strong on some level because there is more diversity within that. Because of the like again, the diversity of the membership, probably like greater freedom, right?
Hmm.
And then the bonds are less based on like we're all the same and more based on the idea like, okay, we're all part of like an interdependent group or community. And we might not necessarily share all the same norms, mores, values, and codes and stuff, right?
Right.
So
But,
I mean,
you
real
know,
good. Yeah.
it's sort of like you look at, again, this is coming during the time of the Industrial Revolution, right? Which is also the time like, Durkheim has been critiqued as a materialist as well. So this is this time like anatomy is becoming very pronounced in medicine, right? And so it makes sense that you see this mechanical, organic metaphor, like organism metaphor, right? And so I think he's looking as like, oh, right, well, look at society and like all these different peoples with specialties depend upon each other, right, in order for society to function, right? You know, the the person, the baker depends on the no, it works, right? The baker
Yeah.
depends on the farmer, and the blacksmith depends on the guy who's has the horses or like whatever you want to use the interdependencies between different specialties and specializations of people living within a community. I think that's kind of how he's viewing this, because he's viewing this organic type of society as one that's just a larger society.
Yeah, but I mean, if we use it as a tool to like understand groups,
Right,
right?
right.
If we take it out of the context of like, okay, we're talking about something that this dude was writing 100 years ago or something,
Yeah,
and we look at it more as a tool to understand what's happening in the world around you.
yeah,
If you're kind of in a thing where you're going to have more of this organic thing going on, you're probably going to have more freedom and less of these pressures because it's a little bit less obvious how you're going to punish people about stuff,
right,
right?
right. Yeah,
And then in ways like greater freedom and all this kind of stuff, right? Now, again, we could
yeah,
debate like rural or urban or something, but I live in like Lincoln Park,
yeah,
big neighborhood in Chicago. There's a lot of diversity amongst the people here, right?
right.
So it'd be pretty weird to like look askance at my neighbor. Like I don't even know what it is exactly. There's like, if I look out my window onto the street where I live, every once in a while the gate will open and there'll be this like religious statue that will come out that's something East Asian. I don't even
Yeah,
recognize who it is. And there'll be like sort of the flower garland around the statue's neck and they'll have a whole thing. And I look out the window and I'm like, oh, that's interesting.
yeah,
That's a curiosity, right?
right, right.
But it's not, it doesn't register as like some big difference within like the community or something like that, right? I'm like, okay, there's a lot of diversity here and it just feels sort of natural, right?
More flexibility. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, I've talked about this book, The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell. And then he has kind of like an updated version. I think it's The Revenge of the Tipping Point or The Tipping Point 2024, whatever it is. So I read this book a little bit ago, and I'm probably going to butcher the analogy a little bit, but I think it's a good one. So in this book, they talk about cheetahs in the United States, cheetahs that are held in captivity, and they were having an issue with breeding. And what's interesting about cheetahs is that they said that the cheetah probably during the whatever the Great Frost or whatever I forgot what the name of that is called, but whenever there was the big
Oh,
frost,
the Ice Age or
the
something like
ice
that.
age, yeah,
Association.
that's it.
Yeah,
There
yeah,
you
yeah.
go. That they said that it's likely because cheetahs are identical. Like their genetics are like 99.999999999% the same. That they probably got down to a mother and some cubs in a cave, and that was it. That's the genetics get down that tight, and then they obviously expanded after that. So what does that mean? Well, in captivity, it's harder to breed them because they're less likely to breed with their own kin, number one. And they're territorial and everything else. So they had this problem where one of the jaguars got, or the cheetahs got sick, you know, and they couldn't figure out what was going on and, whatever. So they were not sure what to do. The numbers were getting down. They brought in another one because this one died. They brought another one in to fill the spot and whatever. But now they're getting sick, and so they're thinking, okay, let's separate them and move them around and whatever. A lot of these cheetahs, I'll kind of skip to it, and I'm hacking it, but I'm not going to go back and tell it the more proper way. A lot of these cheetahs ended up getting sick, and but they were kind of taking them from these different places. The problem was that they were this virus that only really affected cats ended up affecting cheetahs,
Mm.
and it killed off a ton of them. Well, why did it do that? Because genetically they were not diverse. And if they had a larger influx of genetic influence from different kinds of cheetah from different parts of the world, they would have had a better chance at surviving this kind of thing. And then when we do the anthropological thing and bring in human beings, we could think of like smallpox on the Native American population, wiped them out. Why? Because they're sort of a monoculture, and that left them genetically vulnerable to these viruses that they had never, got a hold, never haven't gotten a hold of them yet, and they didn't have enough variation in order to kind of withstand this thing. So, on if we think of that in terms of ideas, then for the final evolution of this long-winded argument, um, the final evolution of this then is the spreading of ideas in a monoculture spreads much more quickly, and it's much more, we could say, morbid, or detrimental, because it can move much more quickly without resistance. And as in a culture that has, or in a group or a society that has diverse kind of groupings of ideologies and individuals, it is much more difficult to spread viruses, A, but B, mental constructs. It's harder for it to flow between person to person because of the differences that people are going to have from each other, and then they're going to present each other when they talk about this thing. They're coming from different places. It's going to have a harder time to take hold in people's minds. And so this is my I guess my politicking for people to interact with other folks, you know?
It's kind of like almost like the metaphor would be like if we're all the same, maybe there's almost like an instinctive thing of like we better not let that other thing come in because it might wipe us all out the way that
Yeah.
virus wiped all the cheetahs out.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, we want to go the way of the cheetah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
so
Like
you get much more of a defensiveness around that.
yeah, sort of like a psychological incest taboo or an ideological incest taboo, or sort of like, I think that happens when you intentionally surround yourself around people who have diverse ideas, and then if you go back to a situation where like everyone sort of thinks like you, or or they think they, relatively closed mind or something like that, it feels very constraining, right? I know that happens to me if like I go back to a situation where it's like, oh, it's all these people I kind of grew up with and like sort of think the same, and I feel like literally feel like it's almost hard to breathe. Um,
You feel the
it
pressure
can
of
be.
it that you were
Yeah.
talking about, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, I heard this wild story. I've been doing a little research for these podcast things here and there, and there's a guy named David French who's real religious conservative figure, right? But not Trump, you know. And his I think he told the tale that his father died and they were at the funeral and he's there with his wife and this note gets passed along to him and he opens up the note and he's not sure what it's going to be, like a note of condolence or like you're literally in the funeral ceremony, and he opens it up and it's a note from someone else in this congregation that I guess he was explaining he'd been going to for years, right? And the note said, I really don't like the way your politics are evolving, like at the funeral.
Interesting.
And he showed it to his wife, and his
Hmm.
wife at the funeral went like, just like exclaimed, like, what the hell is wrong with you people? Like at the funeral,
Yeah.
and folded up the note, crumpled it up, or whatever. And like you could think whatever. I'm sure we could get an equal story on the left or something. So we're not even like trying to
Right.
blast one side in this, but
Right.
it's one of those things where you have like that drive for conformity, like whether it's cheetahs or humans or whatever within that group, then you can really see that defensive reaction, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think just for fairness, because I guess we have kind of spent a lot of time on the right today. is, we talked, I think, a little bit, last week too, but sort of like you can get this zealotry, on the left as well, right?
Yes.
Which can be just as constraining, right? And just as much social pressure and just as vicious, right?
I
Yeah,
think it's
fuck them both.
yeah,
Yeah. We should start rapping.
yeah. So, anyways, I don't know. Like as a closer on it for me, I don't want to like just say organic stuff is better and mechanical stuff is worse, but there is something like if you're going to promote an idea of more like individual freedom and diversity and the ability to maybe like spiritually explore to the extent that you're able to find authenticity, you have to go somewhere in that direction, right?
Yeah.
You know, if you just like think of that as a continuum for the point of what we're discussing, you need like, you know, if it's all going to be locked down in that mechanistic way, you need more space, you know,
It's
to be able to
interesting,
grow
like,
and evolve, you know, and like what Daniel was saying, you need a little bit more than diversity to allow that to happen so that people can diversify themselves out because
mhm,
we're not all going to grow in the same direction, you know, but
right.
we have to be able to be tolerant of one another growing in different directions, right?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's right on. Just it made me think of just reading this book recently, kind of the dawn of everything. But then kind of looking back at Durkheim's theory of some of these smaller societies. What we see in societies which are fairly closed, we look at like some indigenous society, is like they usually have some sort of mechanism for individuals to go through like a rite of passage, right?
Sure.
They go on a vision quest or they go on this journey on themselves. They'll have to leave the group, right? Go on this journey on themselves, in a vision quest of some type to find themselves, right? Um, and so there are these mechanisms kind of built in, with a number of these societies as well. It's kind of another aspect of this.
So they leave a little space for people to find their own spiritual path or something. There's a wisdom in that, I guess, there,
Right.
right?
Yep.
I'd be curious, maybe not this episode, Daniel, because now we're wrapping up, but for me, like we were talking about this social fact stuff, and I was drawn to practices like Zen, Taoism, Tantra that were challenging of those things. You're kind of like our, you know, shamanic person of the group, and I'd be curious what you think about that challenging of those things. Does shamanism purposely say you're supposed to challenge that thing
Well,
or not? Maybe that's
shamanism is not an ism. You know what I mean? Like,
uh, either way, but yeah, yeah, yeah.
but in the practice of the shaman is half in, half out. They walk between the worlds in general. So they were already on the outside. They are literally the furthest thing from society and the closest thing to outside of it. Right? It's the same piece. But yeah, if there's a circle, the shaman is the Venn diagram. He's the circle that is like adjacent to touching the circle, but not inside of it, but also not completely outside of it either. They act in both, and that's their purpose. You know, the purpose is to be able to maintain. Uh, the purpose is multifaceted, but it is in part to intentionally hold the view of nature, the view of spirituality, the view of someone's life on a far different trajectory. To be able to kind of read the tea leaves or, throw the bones or the dice or whatever ritual is there in order to be able to read the signs, and to do some, shamanizing, if you will. But if you're bound to the structure that everybody else is, you're probably not going to be able to be effective at seeing the signs of the universe or hearing the call of nature or having your finger to the wind, whatever euphemism you want to use to be able to, I guess, connect to the subtleties of reality, and then interpret those in a way that is usable for the person who was there seeking out healing, guidance, or some kind of intervention.
Or be able to bring that back to the group, right? To bring something new
Sure.
back to the group, you have to be able to be like, okay, I have to step out of the group. I'm going to connect to the source in a different way, or, and I'm going to bring something new. I at least have to have some foot outside the doors, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, the shaman is at the crossroads. They're at the crossroads of chaos and organization. They're at the crossroads of a tribe and the jungle. You know, they're at the crossroads between sanity and insanity, between light and dark, between ordinary and non-ordinary. You know what I'm saying? Between medicine and poison. You know what I'm saying? Like that is exactly where they are. So this is the role of the shaman, you know, and then based on the practice, they could be more healers or more seers or whatever, but not in a position of leading in that sense, generally speaking, in a position of guidance, not in a position of like, I'm going to force this tribe to do this thing. It's more like, this is what I see, this is what I hear, this is what I feel. This is the best course of action based on my experience, you know, in being outside of this structure of society.
I just found it interesting that we all have some draw in all of our own ways in our practices to things that have some element of that transcendence thing, right? Like there has to be some transcendence that's possible, right?
Yeah,
So we bring in the new, right? Yeah. For the
out
value
with
of
the old,
others, right? Yeah.
out with the
Right.
old,
Well,
in with the
thanks again
new.
for sharing. I wanted to just
Yeah,
ask you about that because it popped in my mind earlier, and I thought that's
yeah,
really interesting, right? What's the shamanic perspective on
yeah,
this?
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
All
Thanks.
right, well, let's wrap it. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being on. Appreciate all the effort and the, inputs and everything else. Audience, thank you so much for listening, or watching, or however you've, consumed our product today. As always, subscribe. If you want to leave a comment, please feel free to do so. We generally respond. Unless you're talking shit, then we may or may not. Just FYI, not because we're scared, just because I don't feel like getting into a battle on YouTube or whatever. But talk your shit. I don't care. It's like it's all good. I appreciate all the love, regardless if it's what do you want to call it, out of smite. But as always, feel free, hit us up, gin and tantra at gmail.com, or on the gram at the Gin and Tantra podcast. If you like what you're seeing from here today, please feel free to check out all of our hundreds of previous episodes that we've been doing this thing for. We'll be back at you for sure, probably in like a week or so. For Ryan and Eric, this is Daniel. We'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.